Hey, Shalom, Shalom, Mishpocha. Welcome to another edition of Ray Bash's Ramblings. I'm your host, Rabbi Yehuda Ben Shomer. Maybe many of my viewers may be too young to remember the old school way of copying documents. We didn't have the luxury to cut and paste on the computer. We had to make carbon copies where there was this sheet of paper and it had like different layers, and you would write something and it would transfer to those other layers, and it was a carbon-based copy. Maybe a more modern example would be the photocopier machine. When you photocopy something and you do it over and over and over and over and over, and you make a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy, the integrity of the original document through these copies gets blurred and marred, and the quality is not as good, and you end up with a piece of paper that's really just all smudgy and blurry, and the type is uncertain, and that's what happens when you duplicate something over and over and over. And spiritually, it's pretty much the same way through generations. Anybody who's passing on their faith, anybody who's passing on their knowledge and their teachings to the next generation, really hope that they instill something in that next generation that will cause them not to be a carbon copy of themselves, but actually to be better. But because of the condition of sin, and because of genetics and many other factors, we kind of see that bad carbon copy take place. I look at my parents and think, my goodness, they were so much better than I was in regards to integrity. I never heard my dad say a bad thing about anybody. I never heard my mom swear even once, and things like that. Just like, heck, I say bad things about people sometimes, and hey, sometimes I slip and say a swear word, and things like that, and you're like, man, I'm just not as good. And then you look back to your grandparents and just think how how they were, how they lived their lives, how it was so pure and full of integrity. And even my parents say, well, man, we're not as good as our parents. And each generation kind of says that, man, I'm not as good as my dad was, or I'm not as good as my parents were, or my grandparents, or whatever. There comes a time within the successive generations that pass by where somebody has to step up and take the torch that they've received from their predecessors and notice, hey, this torch isn't as flaming as it used to be. Matter of fact, it's just kind of embers that are cooling down. I gotta kindle this fire. I gotta reignite this fire. And the torchbearer of that next generation has to make some changes, has to make some reform, has to analyze and look at the generation that has passed before them and the generation that they're in now, and ask themselves, why am I such a bad carbon copy? Why is my generation such a bad carbon copy of the previous ones? What needs to change? What reforms? What needs to take place? And a lot of times the reason being is that you try to stay in the same vein of your predecessors, of your ancestors that came before you, and you don't change with the times. I'm not saying compromise your beliefs. I'm not saying assimilate. I'm saying that look at how the times have changed, and make the appropriate changes to keep the faith, to keep the integrity of the faith current, so that you're not deemed outdated or old-fashioned, and that the old way of doing things just doesn't work anymore, but just modifying that tried and true version of faith, that tried and true version of integrity, and morph it into what necessarily has to take place for it to be strong and solid more than it ever has been. I hope I'm really bringing my point across, and I hope I'm making sense to you viewers out there in this regard. And so if the next generation that comes after us is to be better than we are, we need to take that torch that has been placed in our hands, and before it's too late, reignite, rekindle, make that flame stronger and brighter, so we could pass it on to the next generation. They can see the improvements that we've made, or the necessary changes that we've made, and they would carry on those same methods and modes of reform to make things more crisp, clear, concise, better, straightforward, stronger. It's just like tempering steel. The more times it's heated up, and the more times it's forged, and the more times the impurities are taken out of it, the stronger the steel and the metal becomes. And that's what we want to do for our next generation. We don't want to be poor carbon copies of our patriarchs and matriarchs. We don't want to be poor carbon copies of those who have gone before us, but we want to be, better in everything that we say and do, not to shame our ancestors, to outdo them, but in other words, to make them proud. Because what parent, what ancestor doesn't say, you know what, I want my descendants, I want my children to be better than I ever was. So that's kind of my message to you this morning. So shalom and Shavua Tov Mishpocha. We'll see ya. Bye.